All right. Hello, everyone on the internet watching this. I hope you're having an amazing time with CouchCon so far, and thank you to Chromatic Chimere for hosting this. Today, I am doing an intersectional feminism in tabletop RPGs workshop. I will cover topics like what is intersectional feminism, why it matters in the tabletop world, and I think I've got 12 steps you can take. I've got quite a bit. But before we start, here is my little warning. This is a 101 workshop, and it's aimed at those who have heard of intersectional feminism but don't know too much about it. If you're familiar with intersectional feminism, most of this will be a refresher for you. But please remember, this is going to be heavy and covering a lot of ground in an hour, from race theory to intersectional feminism and intersectionality. If it becomes too much, please feel free to step away. And I made a handout for you all because it's going to help you follow along. So please check out the chat. There is Nightbot is posting the link periodically. So please feel free to open up that handout. Hopefully that will make it easier for you to follow along. So deep breaths, take lots of notes. And I've got a couple more opening announcements that I will start with. First things first, my name is Leona. You can find me on Twitter at Leona Maple. I run Maple Consulting, a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting business. I've been a member of the tabletop RPG community for almost 2 years now. During this time, I've spent a lot of time talking about supporting people of color and intersectionality. I have created initiatives such as BIMPOC Twitter Tuesday. By the way, that means Black, Indigenous, Mixed, and people of color. And I produce Vibrant Visual Victorious, an all BIMPOC one-shot series that streams on Welcome to the Party in an attempt to showcase and elevate the BIMPOC community within the tabletop world. I have a couple years of experience in intersectionality and building intersectional communities. I've also been a part of some and experienced how much of a difference they make in my life. I also started out as an awful feminist, so I get what it's like trying to wade through and understand, well, everything. So please ask me anything, whatever you need to know. This is meant to be an interactive workshop, so I would love comments and questions. I will likely pause once or twice over the duration of this workshop to let the audience know this, and to take a break because I'm going to be talking a lot and I might take a sip of water. And like I said, please remember to grab that handout and chat if you're sticking around. Please feel free to drop comments and questions. And in fact, why don't you shout out things that you want to learn about most so I can try and make sure that I focus those things. Hello, everyone that's showing up. Hi. A couple of other important notes before we dive in. I focus a lot on racism and race theory because that's my lived experience, but we can absolutely pivot to talking about classism, ableism, and so on, and I will try my best to add these things in. And before I can talk about intersectionality, I need to address my intersections. I am South Asian, a woman, mostly able-bodied, but also suffering from mental illness, a closeted queer, and I grew up with a pretty privileged life. I try to be mindful of my ableism and classism. Something that I really want to emphasize about this workshop is the danger of a single story. No community ever is a monolith. So know that you're simply getting the perspective of one person. But if you hear things to the contrary, be open to it and think critically about who is benefiting from that. And of course, no one person ever speaks on behalf of a whole community. Hello, hi everyone. And lastly, a final note about comfort. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I'm going to say some things that might make you uncomfortable. I invite you to sit with it. If it's too much and it's hard to sit with it, please feel free to take that break that you need. How are we doing, chat, so far? I know I covered a lot of big disclaimers. All right, so let's start with some basics and let's dive into race theory for a moment. Before we can even dive into intersectional feminism, we're ready. Yes, okay. We need to talk about the concept of whiteness and privilege and how it shows up in our daily lives. I know that sounds like a really loaded statement, but bear with me. I'm going to take a sip of water. Try not to make that into ASMR. Quite simply, whiteness is considered a default state. Similarly, able bodies are considered default, as is being cisgender and heterosexual. All of these things make up the abstract concept of whiteness, or an ideal norm. Another word to describe this is hegemony. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines hegemony as the social, cultural, ideological, or economic influence exerted by a dominant group. In this case, that dominant group contains white privilege and patriarchy, as well as things like capitalism. They're all kind of connected and interrelated. Growing up as a person of color, I didn't have too many relatable Indian characters on TV shows. They were all white. So were all the billboard ads and bus stand ads and magazines, everywhere I looked, really. I couldn't see myself in anything. So the next time you're watching something or out and about, stop for a moment and see who is shown in that advertisement or on that magazine or on that billboard ad. And think about who is not shown. Often it's people of color, disabled folks, fat folks, religious minorities, and anyone that doesn't fit the norm that's not shown. This is what I mean by whiteness or hegemony. It doesn't just mean race, it means an entire system. Whiteness is a social construct and an ideology, just like how race and gender are social constructs that we have given meaning to. But that doesn't mean that these things don't have an impact on our daily lives. White privilege is a very real thing. Having said that, hello! So exciting to see people hop into chat. Yay! Having said all of that, um, let's cover what privilege is. And before I do that, um, yes, stock footage. Absolutely. It's hard to find people of color in stock footage. It's absolutely 110% a thing. Hello, everyone that's hopping into chat. I'm just pausing here for a moment to say, please open up the handout. I have covered kind of our beginning portion about um, kind of some disclaimers and things like that. So yeah, I'm going to start by diving into privilege now. Privilege is defined as a set of unearned advantages enjoyed by those who do not suffer from a particular oppression simply by virtue of belonging to a specific social or biological group. Privileges are often the hardest to see by those who carry them due to these privileges being normalized by society. The fact that not everybody has these privileges is often forgotten or ignored. Privilege doesn't mean that you haven't worked hard. It just means that your life is easier than others. And Ajay, the handout will be, Nightbot is going to pop the handout in the chat as we go. Power flows, moves, and shifts. Intersectionality expands on concepts like privilege, but examines them in a way that pays attention to all aspects of what is influencing a person's privileges and oppressions. We also need to recognize that in all scenarios, you are never just privileged or oppressed, and in fact, you can be both at the same time. And I want to be really clear, I'm going to also copy the link just in case. Just because you are oppressed on one axis does not negate your privilege on another. This is so important that I'm going to say it again. Just because you are oppressed on one axis does not negate your privilege on another. An example of this was in my race theory class. I'm a woman of color, and I was consistently spoken over by a white gay man. Yes, LGBTQ folks are a marginalized group, but he did not acknowledge that as a white man, he still experiences white privilege and male privilege, and that his life is likely easier as a gay man than a gay man who is a person of color. The fact that he thought it was okay to speak over me is really his privilege in action. So to kind of break that down, there were three intersections at play in this scenario. One, gender, man versus a woman. Two, race, white person versus a person of color. And three, orientation, gay versus someone who was assumed to be straight. I'm not, but he didn't know that. And I see stuff in chat. To identify that despite multiple this was life. Sorry, folks, I'm just reading chat. Yes, that is such an incredible point, Flick. Yes, I I've been struggling with disability too. I was like, do I count as disabled because I'm struggling from a mental illness? And it was this weird kind of journey that I had to go on. So I really relate to that. Yeah, and it's true. We don't really quite see what, there's a certain, look that we considered, like this is the look of a disabled person. And someone that doesn't fit that, we don't consider them disabled, and that's not necessarily true. A lot of the times, a lot of these things are invisible. So, okay, you have privilege, and that sucks because you didn't choose this life, you were just born this way. You probably feel guilty. One, that's okay, but two, stop right there. I'm going to borrow a piece from an author named Robert Jensen in his book, The Heart of Whiteness, where he talks about white fear and white guilt. I do have that book mentioned at the very bottom of the handout as well, if you're interested in reading it. I'm going to use the word whiteness to refer to white privilege, but you can also replace whiteness with that same concept of hegemony or any other power structure that you want to use. Let's start with guilt. White people say they often feel guilty about slavery, for example, but guilt implies responsibility. It's impossible to be responsible for something that happened before you were born. But, he says, by focusing on guilt in this abstract way and centering it on something that happened before your birth means that you don't have to feel guilty about specific cases, which is a convenient way to avoid accountability. Also, this abstract guilt means you don't have to take action because it makes you feel paralyzed and overwhelmed and like there's nothing you can do. Jensen says, get ready to be uncomfortable, that you should feel guilty for the racist acts that you've committed in your lifetime and your failures to do all you can to resist white supremacy and work against it. And feel enough guilt to make sure that you won't repeat those mistakes. This, however, makes your guilt actionable. You can work to reduce your guilt rather than be overwhelmed by it in the abstract. Jensen also mentions 4 fears of white folk, but we can really apply these to any scenario, whether it's race, gender, orientation, and so on. So as I go through these 4 fears, feel free to replace the word whiteness with the scenario that you feel fits best. The 4 fears. 1. That some of what white people, or those in power, have is unearned. 2. That if racial or gender or class equality suddenly happened, that white people slash those in power would lose what they have and the things they own. 3. That white people slash those in power fear a world in which non-white people and or oppressed communities may gain significant power. I think this is perhaps one of the easiest fears of whiteness to spot. For example, Donald Trump and his infamous wall with Mexico is a blatant example of how white people fear they are all going to keep coming here and taking our jobs, quote unquote. There's also a fear that non-white people and marginalized communities might treat white people slash those in power just as badly as they have been treated for so many years. Many of these fears are subconscious and people don't realize they have them. Do you see yourself or the people around you in any of these ideas about white guilt and fear? If so, great. It's okay to feel guilty and scared, but you also need to do something about it. And Jensen has a helpful suggestion for that too. People of color need you to channel your guilt and fear into productive anger. Jensen says you need to get angry, stay angry, but don't let it swallow you into self righteousness. Let your passion for justice fuel your work, but don't let it overlook your own flaws and failures. Recognize your white privilege, your guilt, and your fears, but work to improve the world you live in. When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. Yes, yeah, that's exactly what it is, right? These things are subconscious, and when you're accustomed to privilege and accustomed to having all of these things, to suddenly realize that you may suddenly have a smaller piece of the pie than you actually do, can be a hard reality to adjust to. But that means that other people have less of a piece of the pie than you do, and that's not exactly fair. Okay, I'm gonna pause for chat here because that was a lot of the heavy stuff. How are we doing so far, chat? I will wait. Yeah, be guilty about what you do or don't do now, um, and not for the things that are beyond your control, right? Not racism, sorry, slavery happened over 100 years ago. We can't control that. It happened. Colonialism happened. If we get stuck in our guilt about these things that happened, we're not going to be able to take action, right? Um, we do want to feel guilty about the racist acts that we've committed in our lifetime, or the times that we have not spoken up and said anything. So when you think about, really focusing on what you can do in your lifetime, what's actually actionable for you, these are ways to reduce that guilt. Thank you. I'm glad you guys like the handout. And I'm glad everyone is having a really great time. Thanks, chat. Okay, now we're ready for the main part. What is intersectional feminism? It is made of 2 things. 1, intersectionality, and 2, feminism. First, feminism, as defined by bell hooks, who is an incredibly important Black feminist scholar, is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. And feminism isn't just for women, it's for all genders and people from all walks of life, and it's not about being anti male. Feminism includes sex workers, Indigenous people, and trans folk. Bell Hooks also points out that anyone can be sexist, just as anyone can be racist. You can be oppressed and still be racist, or oppressed and still be sexist, or hey, all 3. But until we, all of us on the gender spectrum, start to consider being more feminist in our actions, that won't change. But there's a problem with feminism as it currently stands. Western women have gained greater class power than their sisters of color. You might know that as white feminism. Here's where intersectionality comes into play. And I did include in the handout a little section about what is white feminism, what is a TERF, like a trans exclusive radical feminist. I can't quite remember the words right now. Just in case anyone wasn't sure about that and wanted a quick definition on that. The other thing that I want to mention here that I completely forgot to put into this thing, you can be oppressed and still be racist towards other people of color. There is no such thing as reverse racism, though. You cannot be racist against the people that are in power. That's not how racism works, just as a sidebar. So now I'm going to actually pause here and emphasize one more thing. Misogynoir, yes, misogynoir is such an important topic to cover. Yes, I'm not covering misogynoir, but absolutely that is one of the things that I'm trying to point to in this workshop, that it's a whole other conversation that can happen. And so much of the stuff that I'm touching on is just me scraping the surface, and there's so much more deeper that you can go into down all of these rabbit holes, right? um so what is intersectionality? It was made by Black women scholars and is born of Black feminism and Black queer theory. Intersectionality is its own unique thing that we bring into our feminism. Intersectionality is a framework that can and should be applied to all social justice work. It's a framework and it's its own unique thing. I'm just emphasizing that. I also found a quote in an article on Quartz by Tamala Gordon. We can't all be Black feminists. It's something you're born into, it isn't acquired. However, we can all, and we should all, adopt a Black feminist agenda. When Black women win, mankind wins. This is something to remember and keep in mind as you begin your journey through intersectional feminism. Remember where it comes from. And these details are incredibly important to keep in mind whenever you explain intersectionality. Yeah, there's definitely it's a week or two long. It's probably even a weekend workshop. I mean, I've done semesters of work on this, right? But I want to try and make it accessible and easy to kind of at least get at some of those basics. So I'm doing my best, and we're doing good for time, honestly. So intersectionality is actually a concept that refers to interactions of social structures like race, class, and gender. Also includes other social structures that I haven't mentioned, by the way, but these are just some of the couple that I'm touching on. I like to imagine intersectionality as a grid, and place yourself on that grid at the intersection of where your race, class, and gender meet. In intersectionality, there is no oppression Olympics where one person's oppression is the worst oppression or more oppressed. That was a lot of oppression in one sentence. Women of color, for example, don't suffer more than a white woman. Instead, we have to recognize that these oppressions are different from each other and unique in their own context and often need unique solutions. Having said that, I'm going to remind you that we can both be privileged and oppressed at the same time in any situation. Just a reminder. But this means that intersectionality meshes incredibly well with feminism. In order to stop sexism and oppression, we need to change the social and political structures we live in. Laws, for example, that are made using only white, middle class perspectives to try and create a certain change may actually have the opposite effect with the communities that were not considered, and this will actually further oppress them, possibly. I use the example of laws because intersectionality doesn't need to be limited to feminism or academia. If other parts of our world, such as businesses and our laws, became more intersectional, we'd be helping to uplift so many different people. How do we feel about that, chat? We're still doing good? Now I'm going to pivot here for a bit to talk about emotional labor while chat catches up because I know there's a little bit of a lag going on. And I just want to touch on what emotional labor is because it's another important concept to remember. So, what is emotional labor? It's defined as putting energy into dealing with the feelings of others, putting them at ease without self regard, or meeting social expectations. It's not inherently a bad thing, actually. However, some people are disproportionately impacted by emotional labor. Some examples of this include friends and family feel more freedom to dump their problems on a woman with expectations of kind words of comfort and sympathy. Promiscuous women are considered slutty, while men are called studs for the exact same behavior. And in both professional and social scenarios, women are deemed negatively aggressive when they stand up for themselves. Good emotional labor can be things like wanting to dress nicely and make a good impression on someone when you meet them for the first time. Having said that, it's important to be mindful of emotional labor and how much of it you ask for from marginalized community members and from each other. Oh, we've covered all of the essentials. Now we can talk applications. First, let's talk about part of the reason why we're here, which is COVID-19. I am of the belief that self-care is a radical thing that capitalism doesn't want you to have. So take the time to look after yourself during these weird and wild times. That's a feminist action too. But we're also living in a world in which racism has ramped up against the Asian community, much like Islamophobia did after 9/11. Donald Trump has incorrectly called COVID-19 the China virus, but his words have a significant impact. Be vigilant for racism and call it out. It's also important to consider our privilege in North America that we have the luxury of being able to stay home and work from home. Not everyone has that. Oxfam Canada states the following, and this is a paragraph that I'm quoting. In every country around the world, the poor and marginalized groups will be hit the hardest. They are more likely to catch the disease and to die from it because of a lack of access to quality health care. They are more likely to lose their jobs and livelihoods, which are precarious and low paid to begin with. They will have few supports on which to fall, with limited access to social protection. They will also be the first to fall victim to racist, xenophobic, and misogynist attacks that we already see on the rise. This is why we need a feminist response to the pandemic. An intersectional feminist approach during this pandemic means that no one group in society will be left behind. So, what can we do about this? We can do our research, and we can advocate for those groups to get a seat at the table of important policy decisions, for one. We can have discussions with our peers, and we can call out injustices when we see them and support those in our community that are at higher risk of getting the virus. And of course, we can practice good social distancing and stay indoors. Um, I've been hearing a lot about things like women, for example, now being forced to kind of stay home more, and how that can expose them to more violence and more danger, things like that. It's the people that might fall through the cracks, and we want to think about them. Now let's shift gears to the other reason why we're here. Tabletop RPGs! Yay! I am of the belief that tabletop RPGs are going to be the next big thing, and I think we have seen an influx of players from diverse backgrounds. Before I dive into this, I'm going to definitely try and engage in self-care. Mm, I'm not seeing this. Yeah. Shucks, that is super tough. Yeah, it's self-care is a tough thing to kind of do sometimes too, especially when there are all of these things that are kind of in the way of it. I really hope things work out for you soon though, Flick. Um, where was I? Yes. So here's the thing about tabletop RPGs. A lot of them were written by white men, and it shows. There's incredibly intense problematics in some games such as D&D, Vampire the Masquerade, and so on. And that's not to say that I don't play these games. I absolutely do. But there's something to be said about dismantling these problematic structures and building worlds and games that are much more inclusive. It's important work. Much like how we talked about whiteness being the default norm, it is also important. It is if that is also the norm in tabletop RPGs, then there's not much escapism to it for players from marginalized communities. And why should we live out the same shit that we live out daily in our fantasy games? I'm gonna pause for a sec again. Before I'm making great. One thing I'm trying to get them to move past is not asking permission to do things, saying sorry. Yes, Sid, that sounds amazing. I'm really glad to hear that you have a really intersectional group going on. What sort of problematic structures should we be watching for in the tabletop RPG space? Aha! I'm gonna get into some of those. Off the top of my head, though, it's things like fantasy racism, or things like um, just problematics, right? So I'm gonna get into more of those though. So I'm gonna keep pushing forward. Um, for example, many of the playable races found in the world of D&D incorporate racial colorism, like I mentioned, by coding darker skinned races as being morally corrupt. How do I get them to move past asking permission and sorries? It's that's a good question. It is tough. Um, I say sorry a lot. I'm a very Canadian person, and I say sorry a lot. And a lot of the times, it's a matter of just being reminded, hey, you don't need to say sorry. Like, there's no reason to apologize. You don't need to kind of and ah or anything like that. Sid does not come up later, so that's why I'm answering it now. Um, and it's just one of those things where I think it's just constant gentle reminders, and it's just about putting it into practice, right? Building a habit takes time, and it's hard to undo a habit that has existed for a very long time. Um, but tabletop RPGs can be freeing to members of marginalized communities because we don't have to be restricted by the same oppressive structures. Intersectional tabletop RPGs allow everyone to feel welcome, comfortable, and included. Players can see themselves in the game and the worlds that we create. That's what makes tabletop RPGs so special. It makes intersectional feminism an important part of creating diverse, inclusive communities and diverse and inclusive games. Another way to ensure that you're creating a welcoming and inclusive table is through safety tools and strong communication before, during, and after a game. And consider encouraging your favorite shows, particularly those that are professional streams, to adopt a more intersectional stance to really make themselves welcoming to all people. Yeah, I definitely find that the tabletop community is pretty inclusive and understanding. And it's just but I have had some people push back against things that I've said. And there's definitely been some debates that I've had on Twitter. It's like, why do we need this? Well, because we're a very diverse group, right? Um, so learn to decolonize your tabletop RPG. And this is something that is required of both players and GMs together. For example, while working together, shape the lore in a manner that removes characters' morality and their potential away from their race. And this is why indie games are so important too. Sometimes decolonizing isn't enough, and we need to build something new from the ground up. If you're building a game, consider adding people of diverse backgrounds to your project. You'll be glad you did. And there are already some amazing games in this regard that we can also support with our dollars and by playing them, such as Bluebeard's Bride, Eclipse Phase, and Monster Hearts, just to name a couple. Funding indie games is an essential part of bringing more intersectional games to the forefront. There are also lots of people and initiatives such as Dots RPG and even my own work with Vibrant Visual Victorious that are trying to bring about change. So please do support these kinds of efforts, whether it's through viewership or even just a donation. Change will not happen overnight, and there are a lot of hard discussions to be had in the community, but it's important to have these discussions. It's important to address topics such as toxic masculinity, white male privilege, and fantasy racism in order to build more inclusive games. And I think those are some of the top three issues that I kind of see in tabletop RPGs is toxic masculinity, white male privilege, fantasy racism. Um, a lot of the times there can be problematics within a game system and how it structures and um for example, oh, this race has to be chaotic evil. No, no, it doesn't, right? Darker skinned characters are always the monsters. They doesn't have to be, right? When we look at things like Tolkien and just kind of the nature of how things are kind of situated. Um, wow, words. It's really hard to come up with words. Um, what I'm trying to say is though, is that there's always this kind of default, right? There's a default around what is considered a monster. There's a default around what is considered a hero. What if we turn that on its head, right? Yes, also represented with miniatures on the table. 110%. I do all of my tabletop gaming online, so I don't really have to deal with miniatures, but that's so true. Um, People of color as miniatures too. What tones do you use for your NPCs? What do you mean by tones for NPCs? Unfortunately, I'm not much of a GM, so I don't really have too many NPCs to kind of speak from of experience. And music and art design, yes. Um, but yeah, Sid, we please feel free to kind of clarify on that question. I would love to answer it. Disability related themes and miniatures. Yes, that would be amazing. Um, Miniatures, I think, are a really cool part of the tabletop RPG community. I just haven't had much experience with them, but I'm really loving that you all are mentioning. See, I have to undo that habit too. Um, More disability related themes and miniatures and everything like that. In terms of skin tones, I tend to mix things up. Yes. You don't have to create a world that is solely people of color. You can absolutely mix it up, right? There's no real like ratio or magical number, but it's great to have variety, right? It's so cool to have women characters. My GM last night was just like, we're running a module, and it's unbelievable to me how many male characters there are in this module. So I make some of them women. My mini in a wheelchair would be amazing. Societal barriers, yes. Um, mm-hmm. Thank you, chat. I'm really loving all of this, all of the commentary and all of the thoughts. All right. So we've covered some foundations. And now here's a list of ways that you can be a stronger intersectional feminist and ally. Now, a lot of these can probably be their own points, so I'm really touching on a bunch of larger discussions. The first one is shut up and listen. Listen to members of marginalized communities. Remember, of course, that no one group is a monolith, and one opinion does not speak for an entire community. But it's important to listen and listen to multiple perspectives. Listen even when you're the one being criticized. It may be hard sometimes to be feminist and realize your feminism still needs work. But feminism isn't about communities tearing each other down, but rather about calling out the injustices still at play so we can all continue to work to improve our worlds. Marginalized communities have perspectives and nuances that may be vastly different from yours, but that doesn't mean their experiences aren't true. Listen to them and work with them towards change. Number two, allyship is a verb, not a noun. It is something that you do constantly. Remember to operate in solidarity. And ally is not an identity. Allyship also means stepping out of the spotlight. It's important to make space for people that don't normally get those opportunities. Or there's two ways of looking at it. You can either say, I am making space for people who don't normally get those opportunities, or you can say, I am stepping out of the way and giving that person the opportunity that they were supposed to have in the first place. Whichever framing kind of works for you. They both kind of say the same thing in different ways. Allies don't take breaks. Is this person trying to help me better, or are they just trying to tear me down? Um, yes, yes. I think that's a really important question to ask. It's important to think critically. Um, and yeah, I would hope that people, if they are calling you in, are trying to help you better rather than trying to tear you down. But it's absolutely important to have that critical question. There's some good conversation happening in chat. I'm so excited. Number three, allies don't take breaks. Hear me out on this one. Oppression is constant. Marginalized community members don't get to take breaks from it. You cannot simply retreat into your privilege when you just don't want to engage. Having said that, I personally believe in self care to prevent burnout and to take the break if you really need it. But especially in things like hard discussions, be mindful that taking that break is a privilege. Number four, allies educate themselves constantly. Know your stuff, know your history, and know your facts. Look up resources online so that you're not increasing emotional labor while educating yourself. Number five, come talk to your cousins and stay in your own lane. Imagine if two black trans women were discussing their life and perspectives with each other on Twitter. That's probably an amazing, rich thread that you can read and learn from. But don't add yourself to that conversation and tell them about your own experiences unless you're a black trans woman. That's what staying in your own lane looks like. Another example is when a person not of a particular community speaks on their behalf. For example, a cis white woman speaking on behalf of the black community or the trans community is definitely not someone who is staying in her own lane. If you're concerned about something someone is doing, it's totally okay to say, hey, I'm not the expert in this situation, but I think you might be, insert a thing such as cultural appropriation here. I'd suggest you consult with, insert someone they can contact that's a good representative of the community. Rather than stepping in and saying, hey, you're appropriating from that community and that I don't belong to, but you're totally appropriating from them, and you shouldn't do that. Stop that at once. It's not actually for you to dictate that. And instead of trying to correct and police people from other races and cultures, correct the people in your community that are doing harm. So talk to your cousins. Um, and so this is really kind of a thing of how you frame things and how you say things, right? It's so important to not speak over or speak on behalf, right? You want to leave room for people from that actual community to speak up and to give their perspectives too. When people say to ignore something such as ableism, yeah, You can't, oh gosh. I will step away when I need to, but it is upsetting when people say to just ignore it because they won't call it out. I can't ignore it because it impacts me directly and daily. Yes, exactly. Um, I don't get to step away from being a person of color. I don't. I don't get to step away from being a woman. And so I deal with that in my every interaction in my everyday life. Um, do I think people judge me differently because because I'm a person of Indian origin and because I'm a woman? Yeah, absolutely. Um, so, it's tough when those sorts of conversations come up because I feel like I have to say my bit. But at the same time, I do try to take those breaks whenever possible, but sometimes it's just not possible. Number 6, you will make mistakes. Listen, apologize, and change. You have a responsibility to learn from your mistakes and do better going forward. These steps are critical in fixing things when you mess up. So really, it's shut up and listen is that first step. Um, Apologize is the second step. Change your behavior is the third. Really learn from the situation and moving forward, do better. That's kind of the four key points of what to do when you make mistakes. Number 7, don't make gendered assumptions and ditch the transphobia. Use and respect people's preferred gender pronouns and normalize the use of preferred gendered pronouns by also sharing what yours are. Further, learn to ditch the gendered language. Don't assume that only women, for example, need contraception. There's plenty of people that don't identify as women that still need contraception. Remember, intersectional feminism is for everyone. Similarly, ditch the ableism. Consider your choice of words in your metaphors. Saying things like that's crazy slash retarded, or I'm so bipolar right now, or I sprained my ankle and now I'm a cripple are incredibly hurtful things to say because they're offensive to people with disabilities and implies that they hold a lower status. Instead, you can say things like, that's unbelievable, I'm really moody right now, and I've sprained my ankle and it's really hindering my ability to get around. Your words can oppress and put people down. And ableism is something that I'm constantly working on. Um, and it's something that I would not consider my lane or my wheelhouse to advise on. So I would actually direct you to someone who is a member of the disabled community to talk to about that. That's an example of me staying in my own lane. Some people say wheelchair bound, but I'm not bound to my wheelchair. It really liberates me to get about. Yeah, absolutely. You're not bound to your wheelchair. It's there to help you. That makes complete sense to me. And because we're in the tabletop RPG community, remember to try and use alt text and captions to make your content accessible, just like the word captioner we're using right now. It's not perfect, but it's something that shows that there's a demand for stuff like this. Number 9, be fat positive and be sex positive, not just body positive. Sex positivity means supporting everyone's right to make choices around sex, including those that don't want to have sex. It empowers positive discussions around sex and ends the stigma. This also includes ending the stigma around STIs and STDs. Using words like clean and dirty have harmful connotations. Instead, say positive and negative. Similarly, fat and curvy are seen as negative comments. Saying you're not sorry, let me correct that. Similarly, fat and curvy have this negative kind of association with them. But saying you're not fat, you're beautiful is the same thing as saying you're not a lesbian, you're a unicorn. It doesn't make sense. Fat can be an identity. It's a word that is being reclaimed. Um, so it's important to, what I'm really trying to say is fat and curvy are not bad words, right? And we need to reclaim them as not being that. Um, Also, avoid saying things like, hey, men like curves, and call out body positive campaigns that only include thin women. You also want to be mindful about how you talk about your own body. Saying things like, I ate too many calories today and now I feel fat can really put down others in their connection with food. I hope that whole section makes sense. Number 10, call out racism, sexism, ableism, and prejudices of all kind, from anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to current issues around racism and COVID-19. Speak up, call it out. Number 11, decenter your perspective. Because society is more likely to listen to a white woman talk about racism than a person of color, for example, white feminists need to be mindful that they are not talking over or for people of color. No matter what work you do or what your privileges are, take care to step back when things aren't about you Educate yourself on things that don't affect you, and pay attention when people speak to their experiences. Overarching theme is follow a broad set of people on your platform so you can have a sense of what language people not. Yes, 110%. I fully agree. I fully believe in curating your timeline. Follow people that have completely different lived experiences from you and really listen to them. I think that's one of the easiest way to educate yourself. There's so much free education on places like Twitter, and there's no reason why you can't get involved in it. Merloff says, always find an issue whenever I identify as fat and someone says, you're not fat, you're pretty, as though they are mutually exclusive. Yeah, I'm fat and I'm pretty. I really appreciate that you're also drawing attention to fat phobia because it's something that literally everyone in my life participates in. Yes. And it's not, it sucks. It sucks. It 110% sucks. And I've had to deal with that my whole life too. So yeah, it's important to stop fat phobia and to call it out, of course, at the same time. Um, if you're food, yeah. If people critique the food you are and are not eating, food is, let's leave food alone, please. Like, there is no reason to food shame people. People are making the choices for their bodies for a reason. Um, and so discussions around food and how we talk about food in relation to our bodies is again something that's incredibly complicated and nuanced, but incredibly important. All right, how far did we get? Number 12, last one. Seek out diverse opinions. We can't possibly consider every single perspective, intersection, and viewpoint. Ask around. There are intersectional feminists and experts like me in every community that are happy to help share their thoughts and perspectives with you when you're stuck on how to deal with an issue. And remember, above all, listen to marginalized voices. Look, I know those are a lot of steps, and sometimes it's hard to know when and what to do. But white allies are, in my opinion, an important part of the solution, and you can speak up for those that don't have a voice. I've had white allies take over hard conversations from me on Twitter when I'm completely out of energy to do the emotional labor of explaining for the 100th time. I've had white allies that gave me opportunities and stepped out of the way to let me have a chance to lead. I honestly wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for my partner, who is my closest ally, who encouraged me to speak up in the first place. So, white allies, we need you to step up, speak up, and know when to step aside. So, that's all I've actually got for you, everyone. I sincerely hope that you found all of this helpful, and let me know in chat if you did and if you learned something new. I want to thank CouchCon for giving me this opportunity to teach, and if you're interested in keeping up with me or consulting with me, please do follow me on Twitter at the Leona Maple. Um, and now we have a little bit of time, I think about 15 minutes or so. Maybe we'll end a couple minutes early to kind of Q&A. 15 minutes. Okay, so we have 15 minutes for Q&A. So toss your questions into chat. If you want me to kind of dive deeper into a topic that I touched on, now is a great time to do that too. So I'm going to take another sip of water. Hey, Kimberlap, you're so welcome. I'm glad you had a great time. Yeah, people don't have realize the impact of words, and it's unfortunate, right? But it's things like this when you call out these things that people start to become more mindful. Like I said, I started as a terrible intersectional feminist. In fact, I started out as a terrible feminist in general. I It's one of those things where when we haven't questioned our own worldview, we can't really, pardon me, we can't really consider that there's another way of looking at things. But the more that I've stopped and listened, and the more that I've been called in by other people and taught, hey, don't use things like African American vernacular English. It's not yours to use. And that's saying things like bleak, for example. It's not my language. I'm not from that community. It's not my thing. So I don't use it, right? It's things like that. And I think it's a gradual process, right? Take it one step at a time. Like I said, I'm working on my ableism right now. And I hope that I can continue to work on things and make myself a stronger intersectional feminist so that I can help you all out as well. Um, what if I want to consult you for a personal project of mine? Hit me up on Twitter. Please feel free to send me a DM on Twitter or check my website out. It's the Leona Maple, which is the same as my handle, .wordpress.com. And you can check me out on there. There's a little forum in which you can contact me and we can chat over email too. and I would love to help you out. All right, chat, what else have we got? I'm really glad that everyone had a really great time with this. I'm not sure how many people stopped by. Oh my goodness, there's almost 30 of you. Thank you all for watching and having. I hope this was really helpful to all of you. Or if chat is quiet, maybe we'll end early. But I'm going to give it a couple more minutes. Hey, Tiger Warden, you're so welcome. I'm really glad it got your gears turning, and I'm really, really excited. I'm happy to help you out if you ever have any questions, or if I touched on something and it's starting to bug you at the back of your brain. You're like, I really want to know more about that. I'm happy to have those conversations. As a DM, it's difficult to fully bring character to life because NPCs are not the heroes. I pulled back a bit because it seemed the stereotypes were being picked up rather than the full person. Interesting. Um, thinking. I think it's important to bring in NPCs that do have various mental illnesses. And I think especially if your table is aware of that and is willing to work with that, right? Um, if yeah, it becomes a little bit more nuanced, right? And that's difficult to do sometimes at the gaming table. And I think that really becomes a conversation that you have to have with your players about how you want them to approach situations like that, and so on and so forth. Very informative. It's nice to have a space to chat with these issues with people. Yes, I'm really, really glad. And I was so happy to see great conversations and discussions in the chat. Sophia, I hope you had a good nap. And Christopher, you're very welcome. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, absolutely. Glad you enjoyed the handout. Personally attacking people bring up things I need to work on. Yes, defensiveness is absolutely a rough thing to overcome. Um, any advice for people who feel personally attacked when marginalized folks just ask them to work on things? Hey, Sim. So, yeah, absolutely. It is very easy to feel attacked when someone says, "Hey, you should really stop doing that." Um, I think the best thing you can do for yourself is when that happens is to kind of be like, okay, thank you. And then just kind of sit with it for a bit, just and really question it, right? Like, okay, this person told me to do this thing. Um, your emotions are valid, right? You're being challenged on something that you've never actually had to experience before, and that you've never really had to question before. So it's okay to feel defensive at first, but really sit with it, really kind of examine how and why. Maybe do some Googling if it's something that you're not too familiar with. Um, and just be gracious about it, right? Someone is taking the time to educate you. So be patient with yourself, be patient with them, and really just kind of accept it with grace and learn from it. At the same time, think critically about it, right? No one community is a monolith, like I said, and one perspective does not speak for all perspectives. So it's important to think critically about what this person is telling you, right? And again, research comes in here and you can really figure out kind of where you stand on the situation. What are some of the best practices for naming characters, especially in fantasy contexts? Oh boy. Let's see. I think, look, I came across, what was it, by Conan, and it was like Earth was just spelled Oerth or something, and it was like Iranistan and things like that. And I was like, this is not good. They were naming places, but it was not good. Um, I think when it comes to naming characters, um, look, here's the thing, right? We absolutely do pull inspiration from the world that we live in. We pull inspiration from other cultures. Do so mindfully and respectfully, right? Really do your research, um and really really just, I think when you come at something with a lot of respect, you're going to be very careful with it. I think fantasy names that are completely not, like, okay, I wouldn't consider an Indian name to be a fantasy name, is what I'm saying, right? You want to come up with something that's original and unique, and that can be kind of hard to do. But I would use an Indian name if my character was kind of based in Indian culture, um, or inspired by that. And I do have a link in the handout to James Mendez Hodes's website. That's a great place to read more about what to do and how to roleplay other races. So, for example, if you were playing someone who's a race different than yours, how do you do that? Do you have any recommendations on discerning when to jump in and stand up for people versus staying in your own lane and letting them speak for themselves? I think it's when you see those conversations where like that person is being so unbelievably stubborn and like, clearly this person of color is trying to educate and this person just isn't listening. Or if they tweet out and they're just like, look, y'all, I'm so tired. Um, or I'm stepping back, things like that. That's always a great time to kind of jump in. I think I think it's good to kind of watch those conversations and to really kind of see like, okay, does the person who's doing the educating seem like they need a break, right? Is this person that they're educating just not getting it, right? And would they possibly benefit from hearing from me? Um, I think it's perfectly okay to jump in on conversations when they're being torn down by someone else, right? I think it's different to staying in your own lane when a conversation is happening between two people from the same community, right? And they're having a discourse that affects them versus a member from a marginalized community educating someone who is in a place of privilege, and especially if that person isn't getting it. Right, delicious. You're very, very welcome. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. Guilt is a big issue for me that I'm never quite sure how to handle. It's nice to hear it addressed. Any more tips? Um, yeah, guilt is a huge issue. Um, I think I think it's really easy to feel guilty, but I think when we start to take those steps towards doing actions that are better for ourselves, for the people around us, that really does help to ease your guilt. I think recognizing your guilt, acknowledging it, admitting it, being upfront about it, and just letting it out there into the world and letting it go is the best thing you can do, right? I feel guilty about my ableism, right? And now I've said that, so I can let that go, right? Because I've been upfront and honest that this is something I feel bad about, but it's also something that I'm working on. And that's really important, is you can feel guilty, but work on it, and that'll help ease your guilt. A lot of academic texts. Oh, cool. YouTube videos. How do you describe their disabilities? Also, I'm a white person when I play D&D. I see how white and Eurocentric it is, and I was wondering, do people have thoughts on how to describe different skin tones? Um, I think there was something about this a little earlier in chat. Um, how do you describe their disabilities? I think here's the thing, right? Um, different races and different abilities or disabilities just need to be a part. It's not something that you need to harp on about for a very long time. It's a normal part of that land and that lore and that community, right? That setting. So, if someone does have a disability, right? Um, it's kind of matter of fact. It's just like, hey, this person I can't come up with an example right now, but you come across this person and they have XYZ. They are also a tall, blonde, I don't know, half elf, things like that. Um when it comes to different skin tones, yeah, it's tricky. It's very hard, I think, to not use food, and this is something that I know some people have an issue with, is like they will describe brown as like, oh, like caramel, or a darker skinned person as chocolate. And that can be quite fetishizing. I think instead, saying things like darker skinned, saying things like maybe medium brown. I admittedly this is something that I'm still working on. And like I said, I'm not much of a GM, so I may not have the best answers to this, but hopefully someone in chat does. Um Iranistan is so damnly, yeah, they it was really bad. And yeah, they totally didn't even Google where the suffix "stan" comes from. Absolutely 100%. I am trying to keep up with chat, but there is quite a bit going on. Intersectional feminism into world building and campaign planning. I think particularly when you're doing world building, really consult, right? Or do research. Really, really look into those places that you're building and that you're borrowing inspiration from. When you're planning a campaign, I'm hoping you would have a diverse table of players, and I think it's okay to ask them, hey, do you mind if I ask you these couple of questions about this? Does this feel like it's spot on? I was part of a campaign where it was very South Asian inspired, and the GM was a white person, but they were totally okay to kind of let me fill in the gaps and to really kind of like broaden the flavor text of the world because it was my own culture that was being displayed. Do, 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 do. You're welcome, Tyler. Came from Conan. Yes, I'm referring to Conan. I just couldn't remember their name. um, 4 minutes. Okay, we're almost done, folks. Um, RPGs have helped on guilt. Awesome. That's cool. Disability should be matter of fact, yeah, but it's really important to make sure they have other defining factors and are fully developed characters. 110%. And I think that's about everything, folks. Is there any last minute questions? And thank you all so much for your questions. Ninja Wolf, you are absolutely so very welcome. I'm really glad that this was really helpful for you. So thank you everyone, very, very much, everyone. I really had a great time presenting this workshop. And I really, really hope that you all enjoyed it too. Okay, we are going to head out, everyone. So bye.